I want to welcome each of you here today. Thank you very much for being here. It's an emotional day for many of us. If you were around and you saw the attacks on 9/11 and were a witness to those events, you probably have a heart full of lots of feelings. We're here to honor the victims and remember their stories while also remembering those who survived and who continue to share their experiences. Colonel Boggess is here to talk with us and share her experience of being at the Pentagon on that day. I think you're going to hear a story about the survivors, their colleagues and friends that she knew. And each of us here probably want to say to each of our veterans, it's our pleasure to say thank you for your service. We're in you, your colleagues, and all veterans' debts. Thank you so much for being here.
Post the colors.
Squad, attention. Carry colors. Forward, march. Mark time. March. Squad. Halt. Present. Colors.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Order. Arms. Post. Colors. Left face. Forward march.
Good morning, everyone. Please be seated. Thank you for joining us today as we take a few minutes to remember the attacks on our country 17 years ago to the day. 9/11 changed the world forever. Today, we're privileged to hear from a 9/11 survivor who was in the Pentagon at the time of the attack. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, currently serving as the Army Reserve Ambassador for the state of West Virginia, retired Colonel Corrina Boggess. Let's give Colonel Boggess a warm Concord welcome. Thank you.
Good morning. I do want to thank you all for being here today, kind of to join us for this very special and solemn occasion. So it's a rough day for me. This might happen several times. I don't usually do anything on this day. So this is the first time I'm actually participating in a ceremony on this day. Usually I wake up, I don't turn on the TV because I don't want to see the minute-by-minute replay. And I read a good book. So 17 years have passed since the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks against the United States claiming the lives of nearly 3,000 victims at the World Trade Center towers in New York City, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and over rural Pennsylvania. Patriot Day is an annual observance to remember those who were injured or died during those terrorist attacks. My ties to 9/11 are strong and run deep. I was in the Pentagon that morning of the attacks. The media provided us with the aftermath of the carnage, but I'd like to take us back in time before that first plane struck that tower at 8:46 a.m. It was a beautiful September morning, unlike today, which is a little bit dreary. The sun was shining bright. There were very few clouds in the sky. People were making their way to their offices through the bustling streets of New York City. Others already arriving at work, perhaps conversing over a cup of morning coffee. In other parts of the Northeast, air travelers were making their way to their seats, trying to shove bags in overhead bins or under their seats, settling in for their long flights to the West Coast. There's always that awkward silence when setting into your seat next to a stranger you've never met. Is this person going to talk to me the entire flight? Or they're going to leave me in peace to read the overpriced newspaper or magazine purchased at the newsstand in the airport? Never realizing how they would be forever connected in the case of Flight 93 come together as a united front to save others at the risk of their own lives. The Pentagon was already buzzing with activity, employees rushing to meetings or making their way down the intricate corridors heading to their offices for another day of work. The Pentagon is actually a very massive structure. It's one of the largest office buildings in the world with over 25,000 workers housed in office space along 17 miles of corridor. There is this statistic that it actually takes 10 minutes to get from one point of that Pentagon to the opposite point. I actually used to joke that it took me longer to walk from my parking space, which I was, which very few people actually have, but I had a parking space, but it took me longer to walk from my parking space to my office than it did to take me to drive in that morning to that parking space. And anybody who's driven in DC knows the traffic is horrendous. The Pentagon is constructed of 10 corridors within 5 wedges, 5 stories high, connected by 5 rings of corridors. For just the context on the magnitude of the building, the U.S. Capitol could fit in one side of the building. Rumor has it that actually Dwight Eisenhower, when he's chief of staff of the Army after World War II, actually got lost wandering in the corridors. And anybody who's actually worked in the Pentagon, you could tell those that had just recently arrived, and I'm talking recently within the last 60 days, because they're usually trying to find an office, wandering the halls aimlessly. The original construction of the Pentagon began on September 11th, 1941, 60 years to the date of 9/11. Since steel was actually directed to the war effort, the initial construction of the Pentagon only consisted of concrete made from sand that had been dredged from the Potomac River. So it was not a steel reinforced building. By the summer of 2001, one wedge of that building was part of a total renovation project. Office workers had actually started moving back into that wedge, so most of the office space was actually still unoccupied. We were actually excited for this renovation, that the entire Pentagon was going to be renovated. But we were excited because it actually meant escalators so that we can quickly move between the floors instead of the old stairwells. It also would include modern bathrooms that didn't carry the odor of 60 years of use. The new wedge was also made with steel reinforced concrete and ballistic windows on the outside walls or offices of the building, which would actually be significant in the number of lives saved by the choice of the building material used in that construction. I had just finished a morning workout and was making my way to my office underground in the Pentagon. I had to finalize preparations for a 10 a.m. meeting in the Human Resources Conference Room above ground, again, about a 10-minute walk from my office. It actually was a coordination meeting on an upcoming exercise that we were going to do that fall to test the business practices of the Army staff and the other joint services if we were required to relocate in the event of an emergency. This actually would be the same conference room destroyed at 9:37 a.m., taking the life of my senior supervisor, Lieutenant General Timothy Maud, and fellow coworkers. I worked in the Personnel Contingency Cell of the Army Operations Center, which provided most of the current information on news reflecting or affecting Army assets that were stationed around the globe. Actually, sitting in the upper left portion of my desk was a draft document I spent the summer writing in collaboration with other government agencies, the CIA, FBI, State Department, for example. This document was titled the Headquarters Department of the Army Mass Casualty Plan. It's actually kind of a significant plan. It was still draft because the director of the Army Operations Center had not approved it. That was the only thing remaining was his signature. But he had just reported into the Pentagon about a month earlier in August. His name was, at that time, Major General Pete Correlli. And so he wasn't ready to sign off on it. And so the Thursday before that Tuesday, this is where my life starts with the events that folded on 9/11. That Thursday before, I was asked to come in and brief him on that plan. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He had already had multiple briefings that day. He was exhausted. It was like a fire hose taking in all the information. And so I was sitting in this conference room explaining this mass casualty plan. And about 30 minutes into it, I could see his eyes glazing over. And he said, I don't get this. I don't get it. I don't understand. What do you mean by a mass casualty? So I had to think for a few seconds, what would institute a mass casualty? And so I said to him, imagine a major airliner plowing into an office building in a major metropolitan city. That was what I had given him as a sample. So he said, well, let me think about it before I sign it. So that document was sitting on my plan or on my desk as a draft. And I was working on other things, and I happened to look up that morning and caught the news broadcasting a live feed of a plane that rammed into one of the Twin Towers in New York City. You could see the smoke billowing from the building. The size of the plane really you couldn't really tell if it was just a small Cessna or something larger. I thought, how odd that actually they were catching it on this live feed when that second plane went into that second tower. In that instant, I realized the gravity of the situation. We were under attack. I reached for that draft document that was sitting there, and I pulled it down, opened the first page, realizing I would not be making that 10 a.m. meeting. As each year passes, we move farther from that tragic day. There is good in moving away from tragedy, as it allows for healing, but it also dulls the memory of the important lessons of courage, unity, strength, and the American spirit reflected in our citizens before, during, and in the aftermath of the carnage. It is a courage demonstrated by the first responders, especially the firefighters in New York City, who made the choice, without regard to their own life, to run into the burning building, saving as many lives as possible, even some choosing to stay in the stairwells with those that couldn't make it down, with the knowledge that they would perish. It's the young female F-16 fighter pilot who had just finished 2 weeks training at her duty station at Andrews Air Force Base outside of DC, who stepped up to volunteer with her squadron commander. They scrambled their unarmed jets with the intent to bring down the fourth plane headed to DC. This was a suicide mission, as there was no live ammunition on the jets at the time. They knew, however, they could use their own aircraft as a weapon to ram the airplane. Her commander agreed to hit the front of the plane. She agreed to aim for the tail of the plane. But it was the brave souls of Flight 93 that made the choice to storm the cockpit, overpowering the hijackers and forcing the plane down on a field in Pennsylvania, thus relieving them of that sacrifice. It actually was several hours before the fighter pilots discovered that they no longer had to carry out this mission as they flew through the skies in search of the hijacked plane. Can you just imagine what was going through their mind, the weight of that mission on their shoulders? They would have to risk the lives of those poor souls on the airplane to save the lives of the many who could be impacted by a direct hit to an office building in DC, be it the Capitol, the White House, or some other prominent building in the city. Upon finally hearing the plane had been brought down, they returned to the DC area, flying over the Pentagon, and tipped their wings. In salute and affirmation, they were on duty guarding our skies. Later, they would become part of the escort for Air Force One, returning the President to the United States back to DC. Other examples include the facility manager who guided employees to safety through the dark, smoky corridors in the Pentagon, even though his torso, arms, and face had been badly burned. It was the newly renovated section of the Pentagon that had been struck by the plane. The steel reinforced concrete held long enough for him to lead them to safety. Many of the employees recently moved into the new section were still actually learning the corridors. Since he was involved in a new office layout, he was intimately familiar with the new corridors and could lead many to safety. I actually knew this man quite well before the tragic day. He actually wasn't well liked. Well, most days he was grumpy, cranky, and didn't seem particularly happy about his job. Of course, I always engaged him in conversation, and I think maybe actually got him to crack a smile one day. But on that day, however, his exceptionalism emerged from the tragedy, and through his own pain, he led his coworkers to safety. The events of that day also brought us closer together as a united country. People reconnected with one another, if only from a shared experience of where they were when they got the news. The American flag planted in the rubble of New York City or draped over the side of the Pentagon gave us comfort in the resiliency of the American spirit. People discovered the best in themselves through service to others. I actually didn't evacuate the Pentagon after it was attacked. I continued to work in my office, accounting for those we lost and finding those transported to local hospitals for care. The building continued to burn above ground as smoke filled our offices underground. Going back to the general that I had briefed that previous Thursday, I had come out of my office to walk down the hall to the crisis action team, and the hall was very smoky. I mean, you could still kind of make out people, but there was this long hallway. And on the opposite of the hallway coming towards me was this general. Now, he was pretty easy to spot because he's extremely tall. So I would say he's about 6'4". But he always wore tanker boots because as generals, they get to wear something unique on their uniform. They don't have you have to wear the same types of uniforms that every other soldier in the Army wears. So in his case, he was a tanker his military career, so he wore his tanker boots, which were really obvious when you saw him walking down the hall. And as we were getting closer, this was the first time I realized that I had seen him since I had briefed him the Thursday before. And he walked up to me, and I did the appropriate greeting with a higher ranking officer, and greeted him, "Good morning, sir." And he looked at me, and I could see just the weight of the world on his shoulders, and he looked down at me, and he said, "You know, I don't really like your scenario very much." And he walked on. It was the utility workers, plumbers, electricians, and facility workers who remained in the building to ensure our survival. They were the ones responsible, actually, for draping that beautiful flag over the building with the floodlights casting a glow in the night sky. Around midnight, I came above ground. I remember walking through the quiet quarters of the building in kind of an eerie silence, except for maybe the sound of water dripping from the sprinkler systems. I came out to actually stand below the carnage. As I looked at the damage, I realized our lives would be forever changed. The events of that day continued to teach us lessons, those who witnessed the events unfolding, those who survived the events, and those who lost loved ones on that tragic day. These individuals become the historians, providing the context for those of you who must now learn through the literature. It is through these dark hours that everyday heroes emerge. It reminds us that everyone has the capacity for exceptionalism. Ernest Hemingway, for whom the bell toll, captured this with, "Today is only one day, and all the days that will ever be. But what will happen in all the other days that ever come can depend on what you do today." Today, in your own personal moments of reflection, I ask that you remember our fallen, but remember the exceptionalism displayed on that tragic day. Thank you for allowing me to play a small part in this remembrance of one of the key moments in our nation's history. We must never forget the lessons learned on that fateful Tuesday morning, 17 years ago today.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. It's much appreciated. Very few of us can imagine, none of us can imagine what people who were on the ground went through that day. It was a day that changed America. This is a day of remembrance. We are here to remember and honor the lives of those who were lost. It's also a day of gratitude, to thank those who served, who were there, the first responders, the volunteers, those who serve on behalf of us. It's also a time of reflection, what this means for us. You know, there were thousands of Americans who lost their lives that day. There were Christians and Muslims and Jews and people of many other faiths. But that was not why their lives were lost.
Their lives were lost simply because there was an attack on America and all that we stand for. They were in the right place to fulfill their destiny that day, and we need to express our gratitude for what they had done. That was a time that brought America to her knees. We were brought to our knees not out of defeat, because that spirit of America continued to live. We were brought to our knees in prayer all across this country. People flocked to churches. Prayers were offered regardless of the faith. Regardless of the faith, prayers were offered at that time. We were not to submit to terrorism. No, this too is a time that we need to pray. We need to pray, and we need to reflect, and we need to express our gratitude, and we need to lift up and ask for comfort for those whose families fail. We need to recognize that it was not just those whose lives were lost and not just their families, but the survivors as well. The survivors have a story. The survivors have suffered as well. And it took a great deal of courage to tell this story today, and we appreciate that. We appreciate that. There is such a thing as survivor's guilt. Why was I spared? Why was I not lost along with my comrade? I tell you what, there was a plan. There was a plan that day, and we need to give each of us in our own way. We need to remember and reflect and honor those. The battle continues to go on. The battle continues to this day. And it is appropriate that we now have that moment of silence, that we express each in his own way, each in her own way, what we feel in our hearts about what occurred on that day, and those who were involved and lost their lives, and those who lived. And I ask you now to please observe a moment of silence. Pray if you choose in your own way this time of remembrance. May America remain the land of the free and the home of the brave. That is my prayer. Amen. Retire the colors.
Squad, attention, forward, march. Mark time, march. Squad, halt. Retrieve colors. Left, face, forward, march.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our ceremony. Please join us for refreshments in the Concord room if you're available. Thank you for attending.